in our roadway hierarchies, we continue to maintain, they're not always narrower, but they're typically lower speed and lower volume. And people cherish living on a low speed, low volume street. And so I think that even though that model of street was forced kind of downward in the hierarchy to the margins, that impulse is still really strong. And this is one I think is really interesting, what some of the transportation planners, like I talked to Jason Patton, who works for ODOT in Oakland, who was really kind of instrumental in their slow streets, is that there's a kind of what he called like a NIMBYism, which is like, I think it's right to not want fast vehicular traffic in your backyard. Like of course, yeah. Your local streets
or your front yard.
In your front yard. Your local, the streets that we live on, many of us would like them to not be thoroughfares.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Active Towns channel. My name is John Simmerman, and that is Professor David Prytherch from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and author of the new book, Reclaiming the Road, Mobility Justice Beyond Complete Streets. We're going to dive into this episode in just a moment, but I did want to say, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Super easy to do. Just click on the join button right here in YouTube down below, or navigate over to activetowns.org. Click on the support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options. Okay, let's get right to it with David. David Prytherch, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for your really great work, John.
David, I love giving my guests just an opportunity to introduce themselves. So who the heck is David?
Okay, well, so David Prytherch, I'm a professor of geography by profession, but I'm a geographer kind of by temperament and nature. I'm a person who's always been fascinated with why places are the way they are. And I discovered geography in college. It's kind of my passion to understand places. And also then with geography, you think critically about places and why they are the way they are and if they could be better. A particular theme for me is transportation. I've always been a person who prefers to walk or bike or use transit anywhere. I've been really fortunate to not have to commute by car to a job probably since I was 21. But I guess as a geographer, if you spend any time as a pedestrian or cyclist on the American street, you start to wonder why things aren't better out there for us. And so as a planner, I teach planning at Miami University. I'm a city councilor. I'm a longstanding member of our planning commission who's trying to make my community a more walkable and bikeable place. But I'm also a scholar who's tried to understand these things from a scholarly point of view. So we can talk more about my deep dive rabbit holes into the worlds of traffic engineering and topics like mobility justice. So yeah, I'm a person who I walked here, I will walk home, and I'll be thinking about streets the whole way.
That's fantastic. And yeah, let's pull up your page here at Miami University. They're in Oxford, Ohio. How large is the city of Oxford, Ohio? What's the population?
Well, it's a really hard question to answer. College towns are notoriously difficult. We estimate maybe 25,000 people, but nearly 20,000 of them are students, are undergraduate and graduate students. So we are a small Midwestern college town, prototypical, beautiful college town, very walkable college town. And what's fun about a small town is you can almost think you can comprehend the whole thing and how it works, which I kind of like. And you might be able to shape it if you work hard at it.
Yeah. And I see that you did your undergraduate there at Penn State, and then your master's and your PhD there in Tucson. And so you definitely have you've got that Midwest sort of appreciation. You've got the desert, the Sonoran desert appreciation. You are also spent some time in Spain, in Valencia. And so you're coming at this from an interesting perspective. You mentioned before we hit the record button that you spent a year in Tucson car-free. And I think that really kind of changes one's appreciation for their geography and the environment, is when you are getting around by means other than an automobile, when we are, immersed in a culture and a setting that is all about the automobile.
Well, I have to tell you just kind of my personal story, which is like I grew up in Eastern Pennsylvania and in a beautiful place, New Hope, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Exurban probably is what we would call it, and in which you really can't get anywhere without an automobile. I did, it was a time when there wasn't so much traffic then. I could walk, and a bicycle was my first mode of experiencing the freedom of just exploring. Um, but pretty soon, like many American young people, I got my driver's license at 16 because it was the ticket to freedom. I would also say, however, that what it was almost immediately when I look back on it, I had to start working at 15 to earn the money to pay for the car insurance to have the freedom. And lo and behold, what did I do with most of my Friday and Saturday nights? I spent them working to pay off the car, and so. But like most Americans, you couldn't imagine there was anything different. How were you possibly going to get around? And even in college, I don't think it dawned on me that one could live car free until I moved to Pittsburgh. Um, and I quickly, after college, I moved to Pittsburgh and I quickly felt my car was becoming more of a liability than an asset. I was worried about it being broken into. I couldn't afford the car insurance and the maintenance. And so I gave it up. And then I started relying on public transit in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is a wonderful, walkable city, incredible urban fabric, great public transit. I gave up my bike there because it's pretty hilly and they didn't have a lot of bike infrastructure, but I just walked everywhere. And yeah, man, it changes your perspective on the world where you come to rely on one thing versus another thing. And I think it was fine until Pittsburgh, but then we continued to try to live that Pittsburgh way when we moved to Tucson. And if you've ever been to Tucson, it's one of our Sunbelt cities are just about as auto dependent as it gets, built for the automobile from the get go. And so it was really, really hard. But those experiences kind of sharpen your. I was saying before we got on mic that I had a bad case of pedestrian rage in Tucson. I just the system is just, it didn't make sense to me and it made me angry. And ultimately, and then when we got a car, people were like, you gotta have a car, you gotta have a car. And we did. All of a sudden, I disliked Tucson less because I was part of the problem and everything flowed so smoothly from me. But God forbid you try to walk to the movies in Tucson. Yeah, it's tough.
Well, and what's interesting, and we mentioned this before we hit the record button. I was just in Tucson earlier this summer as part of my summer of Amtrak explorations around North America,
So amazing.
and yeah, it's what prompted me to do this was the fact that last year I was able to get around Europe for 60 days via Brompton bicycle and train. And it's such a great combination of that train and bicycle combination where you can really open a lot of things up when you have an environment that is truly safe and inviting to ride a bike. When get off the train and you at a new destination, you just take off and you go. And so yeah, Tucson was the first test trip for this summer of traveling around, and I was really impressed with the amount of bike infrastructure that the city has been committed to building out. I've been following the story of Tucson since 2017, so it pretty much predates your time there by quite a bit. But at the same time, the bike is, especially now with electric assist, both of those cities that you have experience with in Pittsburgh and also Tucson, I really considered that a little bit of electric assist to be magical for the heat and magical for the hills. I would imagine it would have been, a delight to have that as an option, rather than just being pedestrian, oriented in Pittsburgh or Tucson, because your range just increases ninefold.
No, it's really true. And we arrived in Pittsburgh as pedestrians and became very, very frustrated, but we became cyclists and it was a wonderful city. Even in the late 90s, they had bicycle boulevards, which I think really put them at the very cutting edge of that incredible network of trails. And I'm a road rider, so you could ride up to Mount Lemmon and stuff. Yeah, no, I think that the e-bike thing is a really interesting one. I mean, that's a whole conversation that some of us, if you're a purist, is it a bicycle? But I think when you when you compare it to an automobile, you start to see that how many people it opens up the freedom. And I honestly think if cars are like, you want to run with the big dogs, you need to be able to keep pace with them, at least in an urban framework. And so having a little bit of speed. Yeah, no, Tucson, I would love to get back to Tucson, and I want to hear more about your journey, because I think try to live car free, in Europe, I think you can. I've gone for 6 months in Europe without driving a car, and you barely bat an eye. The United States, the friction of distance a little bit different. And I think so many people go to Europe and they wonder, I mean, it's so seamless, you almost don't even notice how good the infrastructure is. And we tend to fly home and maybe we wonder whether things are possible. But yeah, I become increasingly trying to import those lessons, which for me, in the most recent book, kind of not only just bicycle infrastructure, which even Europe is still trying to figure out how to do, but the plaza is a really interesting, wonderful thing that we experience in Europe, and then we come home and we have trouble imagining, like, oh, that's a European thing. But I think many of those plazas in Europe were parking lots not very long ago, so they've been wrestling with how to tame the automobile, and they're just a bit further ahead of us. But yeah.
I like to say that we're about 50 years behind many of these places, because they sort of had a little bit of their epiphany with the falling out of the love affair with the automobile back in the 70s, and at least from the context of the Netherlands anyways, that's when a lot of the strife sort of started coming up and bubbling up. I want to go back to Oxford just for a little second, because I was like realizing I don't even know where Oxford is. And so
yeah, there you go.
I wanted to figure this out. And so, you are a hop, skip, and a jump away from Cincinnati, and very close to the state line with Indiana. Whereas, I just skirted past the Amtrak line up on the lakefront line, or whatever they call that. So I just went through Cleveland on my way over to Chicago as I was making my way to Denver. So not too long ago, just earlier in the month in June, I was doing that. So yeah, you're pretty far south in the state of Ohio, not as far as Cincinnati, but that's very interesting. So college town, a bit of that feel of being really, really close to Indianapolis. If you were to describe Oxford, and as a city council member as well, and a member of the planning commission there, how would you describe it from the standpoint of, from an urbanism perspective and from a mobility perspective? How would you describe Oxford right now?
Well, I think it's that one adjective that means so many things, which is it's really a walkable community. And that was one of those things. A small town is my wife is from a small town. She probably wouldn't have loved to move back to. I came from a small town. We had been living in fairly large cities. But after Tucson, it was a small town that felt urban in the best ways. It's walkable, mixed use, great pedestrian infrastructure. We have a public park in the heart of our town that functions like a plaza. When we first came here, I had small children, and it was the music and little kids playing in the fountain, and teenagers in trucks, cruising the outs, and older people sitting on park benches. So it has all of what I would say the great qualities of a great urban neighborhood. It just happens to be that when you walk a mile from the center of town, it becomes rural instantaneously.
Right.
Which for me is a contrast that I love. And this is what I typically love about European places, is that really clear delineation between the urban and the rural. We have our low density suburban neighborhoods also, but you can enjoy the best of both worlds. Like from my house, if I walk a half a mile one direction, I have hand cut ramen noodles and get bubble tea, and I can stroll with an ice cream cone, a really dynamic urban urban environment, but I literally walk a half mile in the other direction and I'm in corn and soybean fields. And so, or forests. So yeah, I think that, but what's so wonderful about a college town is that it's the product of generations of people, thoughtful people trying really hard to create an environment that supports college life. And so it's been a privilege to live and work and try to improve my community with things like bicycle infrastructure, Amtrak, walkability, density, all those things that make a city great. But at the scale of the town, at this scale, you can actually get your hands around it and make progress. I can point to the bicycle lanes that we advocated for, and I can't wait to ride the Amtrak that we but my challenges now is street closures. In the theme of the book, it's not for me now. It's not just about creating ways for us to share the street on the margins as cyclists and pedestrians, but the street is a public space that we in Oxford. COVID helped us experiment with some of that stuff, some of the street closures, but it's hard. It's hard work politically to change such a dominant system. So yeah, but it's a great laboratory and it's a fun, nice place to live, even if it is a little small.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I love that you described it that way in terms of being able to, walk a certain distance, bike a certain distance, and then be on the urban rural fringe. That's very much what it was like for me growing up.
So where are you from?
I grew up in a little town called Lincoln in Northern California, and so, and I actually grew up on a ranch, so I was outside of town, and so, but it wasn't a very big town. It was only about at the time it was only about 4,000 people, but yeah, having that really clear delineation between the urban environment and then the ranch land, the urban environment or the rural environment, and the preserving of agriculture. And I appreciate what you said about, like in Europe, you really see these clear delineations, and you can really appreciate that. Oh, it doesn't take long, and then boom, you are in agricultural land or wild land, et cetera. What's really, really interesting, and I thought a little bit about when I was reading your book, is that there's also a great appreciation for, in a lot of these places, where you can get from village to village through mobility choice. And so you're sort of alluding to this by saying that, you're working hard to get an Amtrak stop in Oxford so that you can have that reconnection to other major cities. Cincinnati is how far away for you? I'm assuming that's your closest city.
Yeah, it's about 35 miles. There's no public transit connection. It would be a long and dangerous bicycle ride. So it's so close, but yet so far. And this is why our college students and I think transportation planning and geography are so fascinating, because for a system to really support a car-free lifestyle, you have to do so many pieces have to come together. You have to be able to get people from Chicago to Oxford, and you need some like long distance transportation. You need good walkability, bikeability. You need short distance trips to connect with your regional centers. But you also do need, for example, things like car sharing for those things that are not accessible by. And this is why people use cars, because it's the Swiss Army knife of transportation. You can do absolutely everything with this one tool, and so to replace that you have to have a really complicated system that hooks all of those different pieces together. The density, the walkability. That's why I say walkability is such a complicated framework to think about, because it's about land use density and mix and pedestrian infrastructure, bicycle infrastructure, regional, and it's like so. To try to keep all of that in mind. But yeah, that's our goal. That's the goal, is I hope that Oxford can become a college town that people can arrive at car-free, live here car-free. But that's a big project in the United States.
So the cardinal line for Amtrak, will linger on this just a little bit longer since I'm in the middle of my Amtrak journeys, and so I'm taking a week-long break from my Amtrak tours around North America. I had some dental work done yesterday, so that's why I'm back in my studio and having this opportunity to discuss this wonderful book that we're going to dive into in just a moment. So that particular line, for Amtrak that I am assuming stops off in Cincinnati and then would go through.
Yeah, so the Cardinal is it will be our train. It's a long distance train that runs from New York City via Washington, D.C., West Virginia, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Chicago. And so it currently stops in Cincinnati and then a small town called Connersville. So it's been a long process to secure. You have to secure a stop first from Amtrak and prove that there's a market viability to it, and then you need to build the station. And it's been I was telling you before we were recording, it's coming up at like 18 years of work before this is done. But we rode the Cardinal just recently. So it was so interesting. We rode it to Albuquerque. We rode the Cardinal to Chicago, and then from Chicago you can just go everywhere on Amtrak. And we rode to Albuquerque, and it was really an epic journey.
Right. Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. Now, so the history for Oxford, I'm assuming it used to be a whistle stop at some point in time. When did it lose its train service?
I think it lost regular train service maybe in the 1950s. Yeah, the geography of most of the United States is hard to understand where the urban places are apart from where the rail lines were. The rail line 120 years ago, it could rival Europe in the fluidity of car-free transportation, and we just dismantled that. I mean, 110 years ago, our streets were walkable, and we had incredible interurban electric service, and you could just live car-free, and the vast majority of people, walked, and so it's going to take. It took us a little while to dismantle that. And it's going to take us a little while to build back up again.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing how quickly it got dismantled, though, right? When you think of it. I mean, because I was just in Boulder, Colorado, and the same thing. Their last train stop, train service was discontinued, I think, in 1952 or 1954. And, it's like they're struggling to try to get train service into Boulder again. But yeah, back in the day, they basically had hourly service between Denver, Union Station area, downtown Denver, and Boulder. And so, yeah, we dismantled what was at one point in time just an amazing, impressive, train network.
Well, we will not talk about national politics, but it turns out it's easier to break stuff than it is to build it.
Good
and
point.
and we managed to break the pedestrianized street 100 years ago. We broke our public transit systems, and they are way more costly to reconstruct than they would have been to just maintain. But that's what the decisions we made.
And here's a little bit of the theme that comes out in your book. So, I mean, the book is Reclaiming the Road, Mobility Justice Beyond Complete Streets. And you go through a wonderful job of going through the history of roads and streets. And, I'm sure you've noticed by now my little coffee mug, Streets Are for People, is that you did a beautiful job of really kind of walking us through the reader through the history of what is a street. And you pay homage to my good friend Peter Norton and the wonderful work that he has done as a historian of telling the story of the battles that have happened out on our streets. Take us back to the beginning and the kernel of that thought that really kind of got you going and planted the seed and said, you know what, I need to write this book. Because you've written other books, scholarly books, and you're co-authors and lead author on other works, as a professor. But what prompted you to want to write Reclaiming the Road?
Well, it's a great question, and I will, what's really interesting. So I mentioned that I've been trying to make sense of how the street came to be the way it is, and partly for me, as with all things, it's historical. Like, how did this product that exists today become dominated by cars? And that's where Peter Norton has just been so profoundly helpful to all of us to understand that there was a battle from before we were born that was waged, and we're living in the aftermath of that battle. So that kind of work helped me a lot. And so there were a couple different things that I've been trying to make sense of is how did the street come to be the way it is? And historians like Peter Norton help a lot. But then if you enter the space of the street, you realize that it's a geographical space. It has a geography, but that geography is very much what we call an infrastructural geography. It's a very particular kind of space you've entered. It's technically a public space, but for the last 100 years, it's been legislated and engineered for vehicular flow, and that's where we're trying to build on what Peter Norton showed is I'm interested as kind of the planner, which is how do our ideas of something like the street, like what do we think the street is for? And Peter does a great job of talking about how people used to think it was for people. And then in the 1920s, there was this epic, violent battle at which at the end, people, not only the cars took over the street, but they took over our idea of the street, which was the street was for cars. And for most of us, it's so naturalized that we scurry across the crosswalk because, we just think we are an interloper. But for me, it's understanding that just as historically, but to understand how that takes physical shape. And that's how, even though I'm a geographer and a planner, had to do a deep dive into the world of transportation law and engineering, because the street, as we see it, is the product of legislation. Like you go back to your state statutes that define what a street is for the purposes of vehicular travel. Like boom, like the law is really clear, and so trying to make sense of that geography, like who has the right of way in the crosswalk was just a basic question for me. And it turns out that was a rabbit hole that I think I'm still burrowing in, because it's really complicated. It gets to some concepts that are at one level really practical, like right of way, like who has to yield to whom. But then they open up some really big philosophical questions, like who has the right to proceed versus another person, who has the power to roll down the road and the other people have to get out of the way. And so there were two trains that had been going on in my thinking, which is one, the practical one, which is to understand those practical things, the statutes, the case law. If you get hit by a car, who bears responsibility? The traffic engineering, the design, the markings, all that stuff that makes the geography, and seeing it and thinking about it. But then thinking about it I always felt in my gut like it just not right. Like it's just not right. Like, but for me then to develop, as many other people have been doing, developing a vocabulary to think about the street as a space that we can apply philosophical questions to, and this is where I have to tip my hat to another really great scholar, Mimi Scheller, who with John Ury, sociologist, who kind of created this new mobilities movement. When I first went to graduate school, I was really interested in thinking about the street, and when I took a class in transportation engineering, and transportation geography, it was basically gravity modeling. We've so come to think about the street as an engineered infrastructure that it's only best analyzed through statistics, and it was not a space, literally or figuratively, in which you could think critically about those relationships. And that's where two things were happening for me. One is like trying to make sense of the practicality of the geography of the street, but also to think about the framework of how we might think critically about a street. So that was my last book in 2018, Law, Engineering, and the American Right of Way, which was really trying to understand that the policy geography of streets, which ultimately became a really deep indictment of how unbelievably auto-centric they are. That then manifests itself in concrete and asphalt, and it's a really powerful system that literally kills 7,500 pedestrians a year. Like it's a machine designed to facilitate the flow of cars at the expense of everybody else. So anyway, that was the critique. But as the planner in me, it's like, well, like all urban spaces, it could be better, right? Like how do we make it better? It's not just about critique. And when I was doing my last book in the late 2010s, I was seeing a couple different things happening. One is that on the street, people were starting to look beyond simply accommodating non-motorists. They were starting to experiment with like, well, it's a public space, why don't we use it like that? So incipient efforts at parklets, periodic street closures for things like summer streets, where they were pushing past just, they were questioning the basic fundamental idea. Well, maybe it's not just transportation infrastructure at all. Maybe it's a public space. Those efforts were really very nascent, though. There were some big examples like Times Square in New York City, but for the most part, very, very limited, but profound. Also, what was happening is that, as a person who's been trying to articulate what transportation equity is and mobility justice is, a lot of those debates were also pushing past into new boundaries where, I'd always been like, what we need is a street that fairly serves all users. That's equity. And other people are saying, what if it's not just about transportation? What about all these other social dimensions of the streets? What about the neighborhoods? And that too was kind of a conversation was building. And that what led me to the book is then the summer of 2020 happened, in which these two conversations, exploded in relevance because of the pandemic, and they also collided with each other. So at one level, it was about that when the pandemic happened, all of a sudden in our cities, we saw, for reasons that we can talk about, cities converting suddenly empty streets into slow streets for people to walk and bike down the middle of, or open streets where they put up barricades and prohibit through traffic, or even permit a cafe table. Or the parklet thing exploded, being in New York City in the summer of 2021, and the restaurant sheds that were like structures with roofs and HVAC systems on the public right away. Like, what's going on here? And so that was really like something really profound had happened at the very same time that our conversations about equity, which had been brewing, what it would mean by mobility justice, it's not just about transportation. All of a sudden, the equity conversation kind of exploded. And those two things really kind of collided, and they were really complicated questions for me. Like, what does this mean that if we start converting streets not just into equitably shared transportation infrastructure, but what if we share them as public spaces? What does that mean? But also the transportation equity thing is really complicated, where I, as a bicycle advocate who's fought tooth and nail for every block of bike lane in my community, to read about the critiques of bicycle lanes and incomplete streets, and critiques about, are these, they just kind of facilitate gentrification, bike lanes are white lanes, and there was a lot of complicated stuff to sort through. And so, the book is my attempt to sort through what was happening through the pandemic and beyond, but also through trying to be really, try to dive down into what would a just street look like that would acknowledge and somehow reconcile all these different debates about equity that were swirling all over the place.
Yeah. Had you started the book before the pandemic?
No, to be honest, it's one of those things, like having done my book in 2018, I was kind of like, what, I think I've done enough with transportation. I'm going to move on to something else. And then 2020 happened, and it was like,
I'm not done with this.
I'm not done with this yet. And I'm really glad that I'm not, because it was super interesting, to push forward theoretically on what do we mean by mobility justice, but also to talk to planners and transportation advocates, the kind of work that you do. It's really, I kind of fangirl over when I get to talk to the planners and the advocates who are trying so hard to make their community better, and how complicated it is, and how thoughtful people are, and how difficult it is to get it right. So it was a pleasure to talk to so many people.
Well, one of the things that I, absolutely loved about the book too, is that as you went through each of the different chapters, you had case studies in there of where you teased out examples from the cities, and again pointing towards some of those pivotal moments, especially in the lessons learned from the pandemic. And so I thought that was a nice construct to the book itself. Now, on screen, we do have some of the various figures. So I'm gonna cycle through some of these, and I'll just give you an opportunity to really quickly just reflect on each of these images. And for the listening only audience, if you wouldn't mind just kind of describing what it is that we're looking at to put it into context. So let's start off with this very first image.
All right, and so this is a picture of a street in Pittsburgh, and in called the Coral Comrie Neighborway. It's basically a bicycle boulevard, and walking down the middle of it is my dear friend Julie Albright and her daughter Honore. They live in that neighborhood, and the street has been slowed through traffic calming and speed humps and signage as an alternative to really busy thoroughfare adjacent, which is too busy and too much parking to put bicycle lanes. So they've created this bicycle boulevard. But in the process, they created a place, a place where you're tempted to want to actually plant plants or stroll down it with your 6-year-old child. And Julie, I actually interviewed her in the book, and she talked about a neighborhood cat that she used to really worry about. But that neighborhood cat can be safe in its own neighborhood because of something so simple as slowing the speed of the vehicles. It's the cars haven't been banned. This doesn't involve some massive investment of infrastructure, some subtle design things, and through a process of engineering public engagement have just transformed not only the street, but the neighborhood. The neighborhood's more livable as a result. So it's really kind of empowering to see.
Yeah. Hat tip to the name too, Neighborways. Do you know the history on that?
I do not. I think this is what.
It's a nod towards Mr. Rogers
Oh, no
in my
way.
neighborhood. Yeah, that's how they came up with it, rather than, because these shared streets, these, bicycle priority, streets, bicycle boulevards, all these different names. And you discuss this in the book, is that they all come with these different names, and some are calling them green streets and greenways and whatever. Yeah, neighborways or
Well, Pittsburgh is,
Mr.
I had the
Rogers'
pleasure of
neighborhood.
once bumping it down. We went to the same movie theater in Squirrel Hill, and I saw Mr. Rogers.
There
So,
you go.
yeah. So yeah, this is and the next image here is an open street, which I think, speaking of kind of misnomers, an open street is really a closed street, but not really closed. So this is the 34th Avenue in Queens in New York, which is. No, I was in New York City. I did 9 case studies across the United States, so I didn't actually, and mostly the research was remote, and so I didn't get to visit all the cities, but I got to visit this neighborhood in Jackson Heights. And what we found on this beautiful fall day was a small craft artisans market lined up along the street. The cars not prohibited, they're still parking. Cars would come down the street, but so slowly that they could be balanced against small vendors who, and while I'm taking the picture, people are just impromptu starting to dance on the asphalt. And and again, it's the power of, yes, they've closed some of the streets. There's some barricades and stuff, but it was the powerful shifting of the idea that a street could be something for vending, for conversation, for dance, and it didn't take a ton of design cues to shift that. And again, for me, thinking about the equity piece, which is that. Wow, like New York City, for example, that street vending was something that was once very, very common and was literally pushed off the streets, the pushcart menace, and made illegal. In our society, in our economy, small vending is a pathway to wealth building. Like it doesn't take a bricks and mortar. And so New York City, by enabling small craftspeople to sell stuff on the street again, this is where a street can do, by opening up your mind about the street not just being about infrastructure and not just to be about, well, how do we better share it among pedestrians and cars? Like, if it's a public space, what work can it do? And one of those forms of work is economic development and uplifting people. So yeah, it's a really great neighborhood. And I could go on and on about this open street, because what happened is that this was the neighbors took charge of this, and there's now a whole 34th Avenue Open Street Coalition of people who have a form of like a quasi-governmental group, an advocacy group that came together because of the pandemic and the idea that, hey, we're going to close these streets. Someone needs to put up the barricades. And now there's a group of people who are managing and activating and advocating before the New York Department of Transportation to reclaim their street. And so there's a whole layer that I only begin to scratch the surface on here is the democracy behind this, which is like, wait a second, like what if a neighborhood could actually have a say over the future of its streets?
Yeah, yeah. Again, it's sort of reframing, that perception of what is a street for. Is it you bring this up, brilliantly in the first chapter of when you're talking about the history of what a street is and what it is for, and you make the comment or the statement that it was previously a public realm and for the public and where people would gather and things would happen. Chuck Marohn with Strong Towns talks about a street as being the platform for building wealth and prosperity for society. Then it transformed into pipes for cars. I frequently call it, a traffic sewer, disparagingly. But now it is starting to, through a whole series of events and movements that have been going on, dating probably all the way back to, some of the first reclaiming of the streets and the ciclovia, that took place in Bogota, many, many years ago, and the open streets events that have come in the aftermath of that. And then really got, really jump started and the fire was thrown, or the fuel was thrown onto the fire during the pandemic to really accelerate that. And I love calling them open streets versus closed streets just because it's a more positive name, because we're opening the street up once again to people. And yeah, you may or you may not be able to drive your car into or through this new open street. But if you're going to actually venture into this space, you're going to do so quite carefully and cautiously. And it brings up a point that you bring up in the book about the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is an area that I'm very familiar with because I keep going back there, studying it and looking at it and documenting it. And people are shocked when they learn that the cycle network in the Netherlands, 60 to 70% of it is actually forms of shared space, shared streets. And so the Fietsstraat is just one of many different typologies of shared street that the Dutch have. Their local access streets may not have any signs at all on them, but they're paved in red bricks or red asphalt that sends a message to the drivers that, oh, this is a shared street environment. I'm no longer in automobile zone, car area. And so it sends the design itself of the street, the narrowness of it, and the color of the paving really sends a reinforced message that, oh, that's right, I'm not in go fast realm. I am in 30 kilometers per hour or lower, zone, and including the home streets where you're looking at more like 15 kilometers per hour, 6 or 7 miles per hour. And so, these streets just kind of reinforce, I think, what I had mentioned earlier is that we're about 50 years behind that revolution that took place in the 1970s, in the Netherlands and other locations there in Europe.
Well, I think that's one level, and this is a great image here because it's an image of a street in the Lower East Side in Manhattan, probably around 1903 or something. But I think what you've hit on is something that to me is just so kind of intellectually fascinating, is that the street is both a mental construct and a physical space. And as a geographer and a planner, those kind of things, that dialectic between what we think a street is and who it should serve and what it should do, that we articulate verbally when we talk to each other and we write down and things like laws. But then those things become manifest and materialized in the way that we design streets. And then that reinforces the mental conception of what the street is for. And so that's what I've been trying to tease. But yeah, this image here is of a super crowded street with the pushcart vendors on the margins and pedestrians and the horse carts. And it was a transportation space. I mean, I think people always understood the street to be a transportation space, but they didn't believe it was exclusively for transportation, and they understood it to be a shared space. I just had a great, I hosted a podcast with Peter Norton and Mimi Scheller, and he was talking about how um, they just applied basic standards of understanding that the street was to be shared. It was for transportation, but nobody had a right to impinge on someone else's experience. You couldn't become a nuisance. It was to dominate it. Yeah. And so that's what the street had been like for millennia. But he also points out that the auto industry, what he calls motordom in his book, they realized that what was necessary for the car to be able to operate freely was not just to engineer the street, but what you first needed was a radical reconceptualization of what the street is. And that's what they effectuated in the 1920s, was a discursive in public discourse and public relations. There was they shifted the terms of the conversation about who was the interloper, who was the rightful person, and what was the proper way to behave in public space. And so it went from, something where I was going back and reading a childhood, The Wind in the Willows, I think, and The Wind in the Willows has I think it's the frog or something, gets a car, and he's a madman, and he's nearly killing people, and society is like, you're a madman for driving so quickly. But so quickly, by the end of the 1930s, the script had been flipped, and it was the pedestrian who was the interloper, and the car and speed were the rightful use of the street. And in the next image, I think, if you have in their books, is how quickly, within a matter of a few decades, not even, we went from a vibrant public space devoted primarily to transportation, but not exclusively, to a sewer for automobiles. And how that was effectuated is itself a really super interesting story. I think, but what's interesting to me, and Peter points out, is that much as dominant as that discourse is, that most of us have trouble conceiving of the road as being anything different. We can't imagine sitting down on it, and unless we forget, if you were to step out into the street and sit down, if you got run over and you damaged the bumper in the process of being run over, you could be held liable for, our system is so now imbued with the assumptions that it just is self-reinforcing. But what then needs to happen, and this is to take this idea from the 1920s, is what we need, and this is where places like the Netherlands have been decades into this, is a radical reconceptualization of what the street is for. That it's not a vehicular space exclusively or even primarily. And those things then can be conveyed through subtle design cues that say, hey, this is why I love the University of Minnesota Press, who was a great publisher to work with, and their designer who put the shared street, Wunderf street signage on the cover, which is so powerful because the car is smaller and behind the child. It's such a, it just conveys that there's something about the order of the street. So, but it takes a while to change a dominant order.
Yeah. Well, and if we go back to this image here of what our streets were like, prior to the domination of the automobile, it helps us, reconnect with the fact that the streets that we now look at and interact with most frequently are really stroads. They're really this mashup between a street and a road, with a road being a conveyance bit of infrastructure that gets you from point A to point B as quickly as possible. In the case of a railroad, you're literally on rails and you're able to get from one point to the next, seamlessly, quickly, smoothly, hopefully. And so what we see mostly in our modern, North American cities is mostly stroads that we interact with, unless we are blessed with and have the grace of some of these quieter residential streets, in our midst. And many places do. Many older cities that existed prior to World War II probably have narrower, quieter, low volume, low speed streets that can be, the basis of, reconnecting us to what, streets really are for without having to break our mind because the so much of what we have has been is a strode is basically a high speed multi-lane corridor. Now the real sad part about what we're looking at here on image, and for the listening only audience, this is multi lanes, but it's basically space that has been carved out in an older historical context. And of course, the space that has been minimized is the space for pedestrians because they've been pushed off to the side and their space has really been reduced dramatically.
But it's interesting what one of the things that kind of something that dawned on me in the writing of the book, which is that even though the dominant idea was we did shift all of our streets into stroads, and you could turn any boulevard into making it a roadway if you raise the speeds and reduce the pedestrian infrastructure. But interestingly, in the United States, we held on to the idea of the shared street in something that's actually quite cherished in our urban tradition, which is the cul-de-sac. And we in the United States as planners, progressive planners, there are a lot of reasons why the cul-de-sac is there are problems with the cul-de-sac in terms of connectivity and exclusivity and so forth. But what it represents is that Americans, even as their transportation system became increasingly dominated by cars, they reserved for themselves, at least on their local streets, a place where you might play pickup street hockey. And which is really interesting. And so, like, I think that I think that your point is a really good one about that it's worth reminding ourselves that these are not new ideas, that for pedestrians, we are reclaiming the street because it was for 99.9% of history, the pedestrians to give up. But it's also the traditions were never completely lost. And in our roadway hierarchies, we continue to maintain, they're not always narrower, but they're typically lower speed and lower volume. And people cherish living on a low speed, low volume street. And so I think that even though that model of street was forced kind of downward in the hierarchy to the margins, that impulse is still really strong. And this is one I think is really interesting, what some of the transportation planners, like I talked to Jason Patton, who works for ODOT in Oakland, who was really kind of instrumental in their slow streets, is that there's a kind of what he called like a NIMBYism, which is like, I think it's right to not want fast vehicular traffic in your backyard. Like
of course, yeah.
Your local streets
or your front yard.
In your front yard. Your local, the streets that we live on, many of us would like them to not be thoroughfares.
Right. Which is an interesting thing for us to grasp as a society, is that for us, we value not having high-speed traffic outside our front door, and yet we are sometimes blind to the fact that, when it comes to getting from A to B efficiently and quickly in our motor vehicle, we'll impose that negativity on other people. So we value our cul-de-sac. We value the fact that, we were lucky enough and privileged enough to purchase a home on a cul-de-sac, and our kids are able to, shoot hoop out in the street, because we put a basketball hoop out there, and they can play frisbee and whatever because we're in a cul-de-sac. And that's a value to us from an urbanist perspective and from a transportation perspective. We hate cul-de-sacs because we know that that's just putting more pressure and more traffic downstream, on the collectors and then on the arterials. And yet I'm like, oh, hey, there's some kernels that we can work with here. Is that, if we value this concept of low volume and low speed, we can work with that. And I like to also point out that not all cul-de-sacs are created equal, and many of them could be absolutely delightful if, and there's a big if if each cul-de-sac is penetrated and connected via an active mobility network. And that's the beauty of Oulu, Finland, where you have a cul-de-sac type of suburban sort of model, but then you have a cohesive network of off-street pathways that deliver people to their meaningful destinations by walking and biking, even up in the Arctic Circle, where, kids are riding 60 to 70% to, the school on bikes through the snow and the darkness. Why? Because there's this safe, network there. So, yeah.
Davis, California, perhaps the most bicycle friendly. But yeah, I think that what you've raised, and this is something that I don't have great images of, but you have an image here of a complete streets, is that what we're talking about whenever we get into transportation and streets, we're talking about a public set of public goods, but also a set of public bads, and access and space. And that's why it's impossible to think about apart from equity, because what we're talking about is how we're sharing something, and who gets the privilege to be mobile at high speed, who has to put up with the risks to them and their family, who has to put up with the noise and the traffic. And so it's a very, very complicated topic to think about. And that's why the complete streets idea is so wonderful, because it even when they weren't saying explicitly that it was a language of equity, was all, complete streets or streets designed for all users of all ages and abilities. It's very much an equity framework. And so at the level of the streets, we've been making a ton of progress in terms of rethinking streets so they're better balanced among different users. And all streets, even the engineers, even though they don't think about equity, if you think about a street typology and you look back into, some of the major kind of like capacity design manuals, they're trying to juggle throughput versus local access. And so this is why we ended up with this hierarchy of streets, which is on an arterial, you're sacrificing access to land and livability for speed and throughput. On a local street, you're prioritizing local access and sacrificing speed. But there's so many different ways we can come at what makes a street fair or not. And I think for many of us who are transportation advocates, in our country, in the United States, just to have the transportation space be equitable, from curb to curb is hard enough. But then what, you're kind of alluding to is that there's so in the book, I'm trying to make sense of all the different ways we can come at equity. One is, of course, the kind of multimodal, that everyone based on their mode should have safety and access. But those of us who are geographers or planners who take a big picture view, we need to think about the system and how it distributes the traffic and who's getting carbon monoxide pushed at them and who gets a quiet cul-de-sac. And, you mentioned the cul-de-sac, like the suburbanites got the cul-de-sac, and whose roads got widened? The people who remained behind in the city, so that the suburbanite could get, I looked at the city of Cincinnati, which had one of the first general plans in the United States in 1925. And they said it's sometimes, advisable to sacrifice sidewalk space to, ensure vehicular flow. And so there've always been these trade-offs, but because they've been obscured behind the language of engineering, which seeks to be very value neutral. I mean, it obfuscates the value judgments behind numbers. And so you can't, you're not, you want to have a political conversation and they're like, no, this is just the standard. So the first thing is to understand that, but we could just come at so many different things. Once you just start talking about the use of public space and who's using it, and we're talking about people, and then we're talking about social justice, that there's a racial and a class and a gender component to who in the United States. You look at the Dangerous by Design, the Complete Streets, the reports on who dies on American streets in the United States. Very young people, like children, older people, people of color, people who live in low-income neighborhoods, indigenous people. So traffic violence maps directly onto racial violence in the United States. But then and then so that's one axis you can think about, but then it gets messy, like this beautiful image of a complete streets, which I find so appealing. Other people who worry about neighborhood stability and gentrification, because all of this has been happening in tandem with the gentrification of many of our cities and skyrocketing prices and displacement, and these public improvements are sometimes coincidental and perhaps a causal agent in urban change and displacement. So that's where you get the critique. So you can worry about great, now we have a bike lane, but all the people of color have been displaced. But then there are other forms that we can think about this. I think a lot of the complete streets is rooted in worries about sustainability. In the United States, transportation is still the single greatest source of carbon emissions, 29%. And so there's an intergenerational equity thing. So like maybe out of fear of gentrification, we don't build a bike lane because we're worried about green gentrification. But then what if we missed an opportunity to reduce some carbon emissions and our grandchildren would have to pay the price? And then you throw into the procedural equity of how streets are designed in the processes. And anyway, it's complicated. And so my goal is to but what I love about planning is that planners have to try to reconcile competing values to make the best decision possible, if that's what they're trying to do. So yeah, this is an image here of a shared street from the National Association of Urban Transportation. I'm trying to think, NACTO, National Association of Transportation. I should be able to remember the acronym. But this is an image of a shared street, which is, again, it's an idea of a street that's shared. I think NACTO, like the Complete Streets movement, is imbued with a sense of equity, and they try to design equity into the street. And it's just, so this is kind of an urban, like the Wunderf, but in an urban context. So this is what's been so interesting, is that these movements have been developing and percolating from advocates and resulting. Here's an image from the NACTO Urban Streets Design Guidelines, or maybe from the Bikeways guidance of a neighborway or a bicycle boulevard. And there's just a kind of a continuum on, sometimes you're trying to exclude the cars and sometimes you're trying to slow them. Sometimes you're trying to prioritize the cyclists, but you're not really trying to create a public space that's 100% shared. And there's just a whole set of typologies that the designers have been trying to come up with, while they themselves, I think, have been wrestling with questions of equity that I think planners themselves probably were blindsided with a little bit. I think the planners have always been, what I say about planning is a perpetual motion machine. Whenever called upon to solve a problem, they often create a new problem. Planners were essential to the building of our highway system and to urban renewal, and now they're trying to repair the damage of that. And they helped people rediscover the city, and now they need to solve the urban affordability problem. So anyway, having set up that big framework, what we're looking at now are some images of my book basically focuses and tries to create kind of a typology. All these things are very messy in terms of what they're called, but I put them into three buckets. One is efforts that are just designed to slow streets, and they're often called slow streets or bicycle boulevards or traffic calming. There's a long tradition in the United States. Again, as you mentioned, with lots of lessons from places like Western Europe to slow streets. So this is an image that in the chapter, I look at cities like Boston, which have been trying to evolve. They had a really great slow streets program that preceded the pandemic, and it wasn't really a pandemic program, and in which they went neighborhood to neighborhood to try to calm traffic, realizing that a neighborhood street shouldn't be a vehicular thoroughfare. So this is an image of, they would go very, very methodical planning process to go in and talk to people and identify the issues and look at the design, the toolkit of different design techniques. So this image shows a map of a neighborhood west of Washington where whether it's a speed hump or it's changing the direction on a street or daylighting an intersection. And they went through neighborhood by neighborhood to try to rebalance these local streets, realizing that, local streets should never have been for fast vehicular traffic. They should be slowed. But interesting, in the next image that you have there is that this is an image of their speed hump zones. And this is an interesting thing I learned along the way, which is that planners would like to do things methodically and engage people. But it turns out that's really time and resource intensive. Um, and who would have thunk? And so what cities like Boston have done is in that toolkit of all these wonderful tools and the procedural tools of talking to people and doing charrettes and all that stuff, Boston's like, we've only got X number of dollars. Why don't we just put them all into speed humps? Not all of them, but they've really designed that, like, of all the tools in the toolkit, the speed hump accomplishes so many of their goals so cost effectively that what they did is we're not very long ago, 10 years ago in Boston, if they would have said to their transportation department, hey, we want to do speed humps, like a lot of agencies, those public works departments would have said, no, we can't do that. Engineering doesn't permit the speed hump. And what about the fire trucks and all that stuff? They basically made the speed hump a standard on local streets. And so that people say, if you live on a local street, expect a speed hump at some point on your street, which is complicated because not only it's like they also have realized that, some of these traffic calming things are really complicated neighborhood political. They're messy. And so at one level, they're leaning into the engineering black box, which is this is just standard policy. We're going to install it, and we're not going to have a charrette about the speed hump. We're just going to install it just like we install a traffic sign. So it's really interesting. And so that Boston's really basic with that. They're just doing the speed hump. This is an image of Oakland slow streets, which was really, a lot of people paid attention to Oakland. Oakland, when pandemic happened, and a whole other theme behind here is that a lot of these transportation agencies, our streets traditionally have been designed by public works departments that were very vehicular. But organizationally, a lot of cities have reorganized their transportation departments into mobility and transportation, Department of Transportation, so OCDOT has a Department of Transportation, but by the time the COVID happened, it was directed by a bicycle infrastructure planner. It's a pretty big shift in the United States. So Oakland, when the pandemic happened, they closed something like 70 miles of streets, closed them. I mean, it was a barricade and a sign that says road closed to through traffic, meant to slow streets. And it was a big splash. A lot of people paid attention to Oakland in terms of policy. A lot of people, people are talking in Pittsburgh. We saw what Oakland was doing. And so Oakland led the way with this, and it was hugely popular in some neighborhoods. And the planner I was talking to, I mentioned before, Jason Patton, who's a transportation planner for OCDOT, he said the planners like me, we were working from home, we were looking at our windows, we saw that people were using the street, but they were they had a blind spot to the idea that in the East Bay and other parts of their city where people were still commuting to work because they were essential workers. They weren't working from home for their professional jobs. They were needing to get to work, and these barricades were in the way, and the city had not asked them, and these neighborhoods had long traditions of not feeling consulted. And so no sooner than Oakland had rallied, closed all these streets, but they were getting pushback from certain neighborhoods about the program. And again, I credit these planners were being very thoughtful. They kind of stopped new installations in the summer of 2020. And even by September 2021, they were grappling with what just happened and what does it mean? And trying, again, because in 2020, George Floyd, the equity piece had a particular salience that it maybe had not. I mean, these cities have been thinking about equity for a really long time, but it just had a particular salience in 2020 that forced people to really ask hard questions. So Oakland, even though they did this wonderful program, was super popular, imitated all over the country, they're working backwards more towards an enhanced Bike Boulevard program.
Okay, David. Yeah. So, we were talking a little bit about the fact that, the kind of the main areas that you discussed in the book include, the slow streets. And so we were talking about that. And then, of course, as we mentioned earlier, because of the pandemic, we ended up having all these other, quick build installations that took place. And of course, the Oakland story was a very interesting story. I had Warren Logan on the channel in the aftermath of everything that went down in Oakland. But yeah, let's accelerate through a couple more. We'll kind of go in a little bit faster format. Some of these other lessons that we you know really learned from as a part of this this quest to try to create more space for people in response to the pandemic and some of the things. And we'll sort of wrap up at the end with where we're at now 5 years later.
Sure. And just to pick up on a theme that cut across all the case studies, which was the transportation system is a very durable system full of lots of rules and regulations and norms that makes change really hard. And so what was really unique was, for a really brief moment, the red tape was just cut. And planners and others rushed into that void to experiment really, really, really quickly. They had a mandate to just try anything that would work. And they were so excited to do that. And what happens when you move really fast is sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you learn some lessons along the way. But what was happening is I was talking to people more in maybe 22 and 2023, is that those initial experiments were becoming kind of baked into a new set of rules. And so, you had the image there that was of like barricades that they threw up really fast, and that Oakland was then in the process of creating a permanent program. And so that was the same, the last case study there of the slow streets was of the city of Pittsburgh, which looked at Oakland and said, hey, we should try that. They learned some things along the way, but they're kind of baking some of those ideas into their capital budgets and their roadway design manuals, so that there a lot of learning accelerated really quickly. And they learned some things, sometimes the hard way, but they learned a lot of really good lessons that they can bake into those permanent programs. So that was the kind of the slowing the streets. And then some of the things that we talked about on a spectrum is where you get a little more aggressive to more like excluding cars from streets. So we were talking about open streets, and looking at case studies. The most famous case study with that is New York City, with its 83 miles of open streets at the height of the pandemic. Some of them were fully closed. Yeah. So, this idea of play streets that had been percolating already a little bit. And there's a really cool interplay between what cities are doing and what the NACDO manuals are saying. So I think if you move forward, New York created this program. And at one level, it was kind of like the slow streets, where there were some barricades. You could access the street with your car. You had to go slow, 5 miles an hour. That's already pretty radical change. But then in the next slide, to me, this is just kind of encapsulates it, which is you could put up a cafe table in the middle of the street. And that is such a profoundly different use of a public street that just pushes beyond mere accommodation or slowing. We're now talking about the street as a public space for dwelling, for sitting down and having a conversation, that reminds us more of a plaza that we would become familiar with in Europe. And this is what they did in New York City. And of course, the results were really uneven. Geographically, they were uneven. Not all neighborhoods did it because they were bottom-up initiatives. Most of the open streets, the maps of the open streets, if you look at them, they're concentrated in Manhattan, for example, or Brooklyn. But that's not universally the case. Again, in Queens, we have the 34th Avenue open street. That this is a very diverse neighborhood, lower income neighborhood, and they took charge of their street. And so, yeah, you could buy a pair of earrings on the street. And I think a whole culture has developed around that sharing that didn't exist before. What's really cool for me then is that by opening up people's minds to the street as a public space, you can now redesign the infrastructure. So this is an image actually of the city of Denver. Denver was another one of those streets that kind of moved forward really quickly with slow and shared streets. Most of them have been pulled back, or almost all of them have. But there are certain streets that are now being fundamentally reconstructed as a plaza, just in the same way that Times Square was. And it would not have been possible without all those quick build interim steps that were less about the barricade than they were less about closing off the street than they were to, maybe they should be called open streets because they opened our minds to what streets streets could be, and what I always talk about is the power that comes from being able to walk down the middle of a street or set a cafe table. It opens your mind in a way that sometimes the infrastructure follows from that. So yeah, cities all over were doing this stuff. Another slow street city was Los Angeles, which has been doing a lot with to complete its streets. They embarked on a slow streets program slower. People in the community were saying do it like Oakland. They weren't so sure they did it. The program, they backed away from a lot of that stuff. But again, so the next image here is that Los Angeles is a particular example of a city that's really doing the green alleys thing really, really well. And so this is the neighborhood of Pacoima, which is in the San Fernando Valley, which is a neighborhood of color and low income. But these were local people, this great organization, this women-led organization called Pacoima Beautiful, that reclaimed the streets and created a public plaza when they realized that it wasn't, didn't have enough shade. They worked to redesign the streets with shade, and in this radical sense that people now ask like, hey, can I hold a birthday party on the street? And it's like, yeah, it's a public space. There's no permits. If you see the plants are getting thirsty because the irrigation system is broken, water them. And so it's just such a different understanding of streets. So the last set of images in the last chapter I had that really went in, and it was the kind of the more full closing of streets and conversion as public space. And San Francisco, this is an image of San Francisco and their shared spaces program. San Francisco, of course, is the leader in this in terms of going back to livable streets with Donald Appleyard, but also with the parklets program, which then led into this idea of doing these shared spaces. And so San Francisco really, they wrestled with it, So the shared spaces, San Francisco is a progressive city. Their parklets had been public spaces, but it turns out that public spaces didn't have the advocates that during the pandemic, all the restaurants and bars wanted this space. And so they opened up the parklets to commercial uses, and the program exploded. And then they had to wrestle with, what does it mean to use these streets in a different way? And this is the politics that are so interesting of like the strange alliances that formed between progressive planners and the Golden Gate Restaurant Association to help both together fight against the fire department, and because fire departments and all this public safety has not been super friendly to a lot of these things. They want to, for good reason, they want to be able to put up a ladder to a building. And so really strange bedfellows came out of this that I think changed the whole. It used to be, for example, a business would say, hey, don't do that parklet. It's going to take away parking from my business. But now a lot of those businesses are saying, hey, I don't need the parking. I'd rather have that space outside for a cafe table. So looking at, San Francisco did this really, really successfully. I looked at Washington, D.C. Portland, Oregon is a great example. Portland's always been a great multimodal city. But, they had really hesitated, like parklets had not taken off in downtown Portland because the business owners hated it. And there were big questions about who owns the street and the privatization of the street. And that's a whole layer that we could talk about. But pandemic just opened. There was just a sense of necessity is the mother of invention. And so they broke through some things. And now they're trying to figure out, what does a permanent program look like that converts streets into public plazas? And so they have a whole public street plaza program in Portland. Again, there are equity issues about where they are. They're not, they tend to already coincide with the already gentrified core of Portland. They don't lend themselves as easily to suburban areas. But one of the things that came through with this is that if one of the most radical things you can do with the street is really make it public, for things to be public, to open them to anybody is just knocks down a lot of those barriers to what makes our cities more livable and equitable. And it forces you to wrestle with what I think are like the questions that park departments have been dealing with forever. Like, how do you deal with quality of life issues? Do you lease out some public space for a cafe? Does that add something even if it takes away? Like things that we've not had, the idea of leasing out street space. the Portland Department of Transportation has people, you can borrow a set of game boards, like board games, from a Department of Transportation. They've got a collection of board games to help you activate the street space. Since when do departments of transportation have collections of board games?
Since now.
Since now.
Yeah.
And I think those things they're little. And these, what I come around to in the book is that these conversions they happened all over the United States. These just happened to be really big cities, but many small towns closed off alleys or created parklets. This was not limited to these big cities. But ultimately these were modest changes. Most of our streets remain I mean, I never tried to quantify them, the amount of these shared streets, but they're fractions of percentages probably in terms of the overall roadways in the United States. But it's a profound idea, and it gives me optimism. If you open up your mind to what's possible and you hold on to that idea, just like it was a crazy idea 110 years ago to give over streets to cars, and it happened remarkably fast. I'm not saying that we're going to see that conversion, but it's possible to rethink our streets and remake them much more quickly. And what one of the things I came away with, and maybe this is the pragmatic planner in me, is that it's going to take advocates. And one of the countervailing forces to the auto industry is the real estate. And, there are a lot of bars and restaurants and neighborhood associations. There's a lot of downtown business improvement districts who have if you look at the street, there's a lot of real estate there. And we have to worry about the gentrification issues. We have to worry about the privatization issues. But, one of the reasons why these cities were able to do this stuff is because it made cities more livable. It made their businesses more vibrant and profitable. It enlivened downtowns. And so I like to think that there's some alliances that were forged that may enable these to not just be passing phenomena, that these may last because there's some people who have a stake in the street, not going back to just being, fast traffic and parked cars.
Love it. Reclaiming the road, mobility justice beyond complete streets. David, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast. This has been so much fun.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for all the work that you do. And we weren't talking too much about activity and health, but I think that the tie-ins to, the health of ourselves and our communities are, pretty self-evident in reclaiming these streets from cars.
Exactly. All right, very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John.
Hey, thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode talking about the new book, Reclaiming the Road. And if you did, please, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and share it with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, be honored to have you subscribe to the channel. Just click on the subscription button down below and ring that notifications bell. And again, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Again, super easy to do. Just click on the join button right here in YouTube or navigate over to activetowns.org. Click on the support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Patrons do get early and ad-free access to all this video content. Okay, that's all for now. And until next time, this is John signing off by wishing you much activity, health, and happiness. Cheers. And again, just want to send a huge thank you to all my Active Towns ambassadors supporting the channel financially via YouTube memberships, YouTube super thanks, as well as making contributions to the nonprofit and joining my Patreon. Every little bit adds up and is very much appreciated. Thank you all so much.